What is the most chaotic, insane, and absolutely unbelievable wedding you have ever witnessed? I once watched a groom get arrested at his own wedding in a parking lot of an abandoned motel after a pot of mystery stew caught on fire and the bride realized they weren't even legally married. This was a wedding my coworker invited my wife and me to. I barely knew the guy outside of office small talk, but he kept insisting it was going to be legendary, which should have been the first red flag. The venue wasn't really a venue either. It was an abandoned roadside motel that someone's uncle apparently owned. Half the rooms had boarded windows, and there was a burned-out vending machine tipped over near the entrance like nobody had touched it in years. The ceremony area was set up in the parking lot. Folding chairs, extension cords running everywhere, and a Bluetooth speaker duct taped to a chair playing distorted country music. The groom showed up already sweating through a white tank top instead of a suit, pacing around and yelling into his phone about someone bringing the wrong cooler. The bride looked exhausted before it even started. Mascara already smudged, arguing with her sister about missing cash envelopes. The actual ceremony lasted maybe 4 minutes. The officiant forgot their names halfway through and laughed it off. People cheered like that was normal. Then things got weird. Instead of catering, they had this massive pot set up over a propane burner. The groom kept bragging that he made the food himself and that it was some family recipe stew. It smelled of not spoiled exactly, just heavy and metallic. Nobody was really eating it except a few drunk friends. About an hour in, one of the guests started yelling because his truck had been blocked in. That turned into shouting between 3 different groups of people who apparently all had old drama with each other. Someone threw a plastic chair. Music stopped. The bride disappeared inside one of the motel rooms crying. Meanwhile, the groom was getting more aggressive by the minute, slamming beers and telling everyone to relax because this is how real weddings go. Then the power went out. Complete darkness except for headlights and phone flashlights. Turns out someone had overloaded the extension cords running the lights, speaker, and the burner at the same time. When everything cut, the propane flame under the pot went out too, and the whole thing tipped when someone bumped it in the chaos. Hot stew poured across the pavement and into the parking lot drain. The smell got instantly worse, like burned meat and gasoline. That's when 2 police cars rolled in. Apparently neighbors had already called about noise, fighting, and people wandering into the road. The groom immediately started arguing with the officers, yelling about how they were ruining his night. One of his friends tried to film it and kept getting in the officers' faces. My wife and I didn't even say anything to each other. We just made eye contact, grabbed our jackets, and walked straight to the car while everyone else was still shouting. On the way out, we saw the bride sitting on the curb alone, still in her dress, smoking and staring at nothing, while the groom was being handcuffed for refusing to calm down. Found out later, the marriage paperwork never even got signed because nobody could find it after the shutdown. They technically weren't married at all. Story 2. I once went to a wedding where the cake caught on fire. The groom's dad interrogated guests for cash to pay off debts, and a guy between court dates tried to recruit me into a crypto-reptile business. This was a wedding I went to in my mid-20s for a former roommate's cousin. We weren't close, but I got invited because they needed to fill tables. That should have been my first clue. The invitation was printed on neon green paper in Comic Sans and said, in bold, cash only. No cheap gifts, which already felt aggressive. A week before the wedding, though, the bride's aunt messaged me privately and told me not to bring money because the groom's dad planned to collect it to settle debts. She didn't elaborate, just said, trust me, bring something they can physically hold. So I bought them a decent kitchen appliance and called it a day. The venue, a half-renovated community rec center next to a closed bowling alley. The ceremony space was divided from a Zumba classroom by a flimsy folding partition. You could literally hear Latin dance music thumping during the prelude. The bride walked down the aisle to a YouTube instrumental track that kept buffering. It would play for 10 seconds, cut out, then restart from the beginning. No one fixed it. They just stood there smiling through the awkward silence while someone's kid loudly asked why the bride looked mad. She did look mad, probably because her dress didn't fit. I overheard someone say it arrived 2 sizes too small, and they made it work. The back was laced up with what looked like silver ribbon from a craft store. You could see red marks on her shoulders where it was digging in. Ceremony lasted maybe 6 minutes. Novos, just do you. Yeah, cool. Now the reception. There was no bartender. Instead, there were 2 coolers filled with random cans, warm beer, off-brand soda, and what I swear was a gallon jug of something unlabeled with a ladle in it. No ice, just vibes. The food was alarming. Aluminum trays of pasta that were still cold in the middle. A salad that looked pre-dressed hours ago and was sweating. The groom's dad stood near the buffet telling people to take small portions because food cost money. Then came the cake. It was sitting on a plastic folding table directly under one of those tall patio heaters they drag dragged inside because the hall's heating didn't work. During speeches, which were mostly drunken roasts, someone adjusted the heater. The flame flared. The decorative fake flowers on top of the cake went up instantly. At first, everyone laughed because they thought it was part of some dramatic sparkler effect. It was not. The bride screamed. Someone tried to blow it out. That made it worse. Frosting started dripping and smoking. Finally, a guest dumped a cup of Sprite on it, which half extinguished it but also turned the top tier into a melted, sugary sludge sliding sideways. And that's when the money drama exploded. The groom's dad began going table to table asking who brought cash. Not discreetly, loudly. When he got to me and saw the wrap box, he actually asked, "So you ignored the instructions?" I said I must have misunderstood. He rolled his eyes and muttered something about people being selfish. Meanwhile, one of the groom's friends, wearing basketball shorts and flip-flops, sat down next to me and immediately started oversharing. Told me he was between court dates and that he had a business idea involving cryptocurrency and exotic reptiles. Then he leaned in and said he could reset your immune system with some kind of herbal cleanse he bought online. He asked if I wanted to invest. I said no. He asked for my Instagram instead. While this was happening, two relatives were arguing near the gift table because someone had opened a card box early and counted the envelopes. The bride ended up crying in the bathroom. The groom disappeared outside for almost an hour. Nobody knew where he went. By 9 p.m., half the guests had left. The Zumba class next door was louder than the dance floor. The DJ, a cousin with a laptop, kept replaying the same 3 songs because his playlist wasn't downloaded offline. When we finally left, the burned cake was still sitting there, half collapsed, like a symbol of the whole night. Story 3. I went to a luxury hotel wedding where the groom got so drunk he disappeared from his own reception, and the bride spent her wedding night alone in the honeymoon suite. That's how the night went. The ceremony itself was small, only close relatives allowed, and then everyone else showed up later for the reception at a fairly upscale hotel ballroom. At first glance, it looked completely normal. Nice lighting, plated meals, a big dance floor. You think it was going to be one of those predictable, polite weddings where nothing memorable happens. Except the groom was already a mess when guests arrived. He wasn't emotional or nervous. He was sloppy, talking too loudly, losing his balance, hugging strangers like they were lifelong friends. People joked about him celebrating too early, but it kept getting worse. By the time introductions happened, he looked like he was struggling to stay upright. About an hour into the reception, everything started unraveling. The bar suddenly stopped serving alcohol. No announcement, just bartenders packing things away while guests argued with staff. Word spread quickly that several people had gotten sick at the same time. Bathrooms were closed because sinks were clogged and water had started spreading onto the floor. Hotel employees were rushing around with mops while guests stood outside complaining. Inside the hall, the bride was trying to keep the schedule moving, but the groom was barely present anymore. During their first dance, he just shuffled around without really engaging, staring off like he forgot where he was. The bride kept smiling for the crowd, but it looked forced. When the song ended, he wandered off instead of returning to the head table. Dinner was worse. Instead of sitting beside his wife, he ended up on the carpet near one of the side walls, eating from his plate while sitting down like he needed to steady himself. Shoes half off, jacket missing, completely detached from what was happening around him. Guests kept stepping around him awkwardly, while the bride stayed at the main table alone, making small talk and pretending everything was fine. People started whispering. Some thought he was sick. Others thought he'd taken something. No one really knew. Then, sometime later, he was just gone. Story 4. I followed a barefoot stranger to a wedding reception for free drinks, and walked into what felt like a sweaty cult gathering inside a luxury hotel ballroom. I wasn't even a guest. I was staying at a huge hotel for work about 10 years ago, sitting at the lobby bar when a guy in wrinkled linen pants and no shoes started talking to me. He said their wedding party had way too much food and alcohol, and told me to come upstairs and help them solve the problem. Free dinner and drinks sounded harmless enough, so I followed him. The second the doors opened, I knew I'd made a mistake. The heat hit first. Not normal warm, heavy, humid heat like the air conditioning had lost the fight hours earlier. The smell was a mix of sweat, incense, and buffet food sitting out too long. People were dancing barefoot on the carpet, and more than a few guests had abandoned shirts entirely. Nobody seemed bothered by it. Everyone looked flushed and shiny like they'd been inside that room all day. The crowd had this very specific look. Tangled hair, loose clothes, beads, patchwork fabrics. Like a music festival had accidentally been moved indoors. A handful of people looked normally dressed, but they stood out immediately. There wasn't a DJ. Instead, the guy on stage was surrounded by instruments that looked like they'd been collected from different continents. Drums, hand percussion, some long wooden horn, random strings. The music wasn't really songs, just long, echoing noise while people swayed around with their eyes closed. I grabbed a plate mostly, so I didn't look out of place. The food had clearly been sitting there a while, so I picked something simple and stayed near the wall. Every surface felt slightly sticky. People kept hugging strangers, laughing loudly, spilling drinks, then ignoring it. After maybe 10 minutes, I realized nobody there actually knew who I was, and nobody cared either. It felt less like a wedding and more like walking into someone else's exhausting after party. I slipped out as soon as the guy who invited me got pulled into a drum circle. The next morning, I walked past the ballroom again on my way to check out. The doors were propped open, and hotel staff were hauling out black garbage bags by the dozen. Empty bottles, decorations, food trays, just piles of it being loaded onto carts. The carpet looked darker in patches, like something had soaked into it overnight. I remember feeling bad for the cleaning crew more than anything else. Story 5. No alcohol. No chemistry. Not enough food. And a first kiss so awkward the officiant accidentally roasted them into silence. This was 2 classmates of mine from university. Nice enough people, just painfully awkward together. The ceremony was held in a small church hall that had fluorescent lighting bright enough to make everything look washed out and tired. The bride had made her own gown. I genuinely respect the effort, but it didn't fit. She's very petite, and the dress hung on her frame like it belonged to someone else. It wasn't tailored at all, just smooth white fabric draping straight down, more like formal sleepwear than bridal. You could tell she'd worked hard on it, which somehow made it worse because no one had stepped in to help her adjust it. They'd apparently never kissed before that day, so when it came time, they sort of leaned toward each other stiffly and brushed lips for half a second. It looked like 2 people unsure of where to place their hands. The officiant actually chuckled and said, "That's it," into the microphone. No one laughed. There was a segment where both sets of parents gave blessings. The groom's side kept it short and heartfelt. A quick hug, a few sentences done. Then the bride's parents stepped up. Her mother cried loudly into the microphone for what felt like forever, retelling childhood stories in excruciating detail. Her father followed with his own emotional speech that dragged on just as long. Guests shifted in their seats. A few people checked their phones. It didn't feel intimate. It felt like we were trapped in someone else's family therapy session. The reception was in a multipurpose room with folding tables. Instead of catering, guests had been asked to bring dishes. There wasn't nearly enough. By the time the last tables were called up, most trays were scraped empty. People were quietly dividing dinner rolls in half. The color theme was pale blue and soft purple, ribbons, tablecloths, balloons. But under the harsh lighting, it all looked faded. A friend of theirs was running music off a laptop. At one point, the bride's mom handed him a folded note and insisted he read it out loud. He hesitated, then awkwardly announced something along the lines of, "Groom, your mother-in-law says you're allowed to enjoy the shirt now." Apparently, she'd given her daughter a novelty t-shirt months earlier with kittens printed across the chest area, and this was some inside joke about it. Nobody outside their immediate family understood. It just landed flat. I had arranged the bouquets and centerpieces as a gift. I'd specifically asked that they be kept cool until setup. They weren't. By the time guests arrived, the flowers were already drooping. The next morning, they looked completely defeated. And yes, no alcohol. Not even a toast. Before I tell you what happens next, don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 6. Picture this. Long black trench coats indoors, sunglasses at night, a cheating scandal no one was allowed to mention, and the groom's dad drunkenly fighting his wife mid-reception. They had fully committed to a sci-fi theme based on their favorite film. Not subtle references, either full commitment. Long black coats, narrow sunglasses indoors, dramatic poses for photos. The groomsmen kept addressing each other by character names from the movie and congratulating themselves every time someone understood the reference. Most people didn't. The MC had prepared a slideshow that played during dinner. It was supposed to be funny, but it was just screenshots from the movie with the wedding party's faces poorly edited on top. The room stayed mostly quiet while it played, except for a few forced laughs from the groom's friends. Underneath all that, the atmosphere felt tense. You could tell something had happened recently. Later, I found out the groom had been unfaithful not long before the wedding, and instead of postponing things, they went ahead anyway. The 2 families clearly knew. His relatives acted like he'd done nothing wrong, while hers looked like they were enduring the entire evening out of obligation. The maid of honor, the bride's sister, gave a speech that sounded polite on the surface but had an edge to it. She kept emphasizing the groom's name in this pointed way, like she was reminding everyone who was responsible for the situation. Half the room caught it, half didn't, which somehow made it more uncomfortable. Then the groom's father took the microphone. He launched into a long story that wandered all over the place about marriage, loyalty, and how women were supposed to be patient. It didn't really make sense and dragged on long enough that people started shifting in their seats. Eventually, the DJ faded music in just to end it. Not long after, the father, already drunk, started dancing very enthusiastically with someone who was definitely not his wife. His actual wife noticed almost immediately, stormed onto the dance floor, and the argument that followed stopped everything. Music cut out. Guests froze. They were shouting at each other while staff tried to pretend nothing was happening. To recover, someone brought in a small live band that had been hired for later in the evening. They started playing classical pieces, but they were clearly nervous and out of sync. One instrument kept squeaking every few notes, which only made the whole situation feel more surreal. Then the weather turned. Heavy rain started suddenly, and people began slipping out early under the excuse of beating traffic. Outside, I watched the wedding party sprint toward their cars, holding their long coats over their heads while trying not to ruin their sunglasses. Inside, the band kept playing to a half-empty room while the newlyweds stood on opposite sides of the floor, talking to different groups of people. Story 7. I once stood in a 100-degree park shelter wearing a cardboard hat full of ants while the wedding photographer, who wasn't allowed near children, shot the ceremony like it was a crime scene, and they divorced 3 months later. This was a friend of a friend's wedding a few years ago, and they had decided to pinch every possible penny. Normally, budget weddings can be charming, even endearing, but this one crossed the line into straight-up disastrous. The ceremony was in mid-July outdoors, under a park shelter with zero ventilation. Heat pressed down, flies buzzed, and the guests were already sweating before the vows even started. The bride insisted that all bridesmaids wear fancy hats she crafted herself from discarded cardboard, glue, and scraps of ribbon. Mine had a small colony of ants hiding in the brim. I didn't notice until it was too late. She'd had a string of previous maids of honor, 3 in total, who all quit, mostly because of family drama. I was flattered but nervous when she asked me. They wanted live music but refused to hire anyone competent. A friend's cousin agreed to play a keyboard for a small fee. She didn't know how to actually perform, so she just hit random keys while a speaker played a pre-recorded wedding march in the background. The volume fluctuated wildly because the woman making the cake was blasting a pop radio station while attempting to frost a tiered cake in the hot shelter kitchen. The icing melted faster than she could apply it. The couple attempted to write their own vows. A massive argument broke out over phrasing, and they never told the officiant until the morning of the wedding that no vows would be read. Luckily, the officiant had a set of generic vows stashed away in his binder. The bride's dress came from a bargain website and was way too tight. We had to rip seams and pin in extra satin strips, which clashed with the off-white color. The groom made passive-aggressive comments the entire morning because his mother had originally promised to fund the gown, but then backed out to help her other son. Dinner was a bizarre mix: overcooked spaghetti, limp green beans, and orange soda from fast food cups. Most of the groom's family, including his best man and groomsmen, vanished immediately after plates were handed out. His mother had left too, meaning the traditional mother-son dance couldn't happen. Only the ring bearer remained, and we ended up taking him home ourselves because the family refused to return for him. The groom had skipped rehearsal entirely and showed up visibly intoxicated. 2 of the bride's aunts tried to pocket the cash envelope, so we put a tall friend on security duty. Even the bride's brother couldn't be trusted. We caught him taking a $50 bill and had to confiscate it. The portable toilets were filthy and smelled like ammonia. The photographer, also the bride's uncle, was a registered sex offender. Because of restrictions, he could only shoot from a distance using a telephoto lens, making the pictures look like surveillance footage instead of wedding memories. Less than 3 months later, they divorced. Story 8. I work hundreds of weddings, but I've never seen a bride give a full lap dance in the middle of the reception while her mom cheered like it was the Super Bowl. I worked at this lakeside event hall that rented out a massive pavilion for weddings, funerals, and other gatherings. It was normally classy, but one family completely destroyed the place with a wedding that still haunts my memories. They had chosen a jumble bird motif. Decorations were mismatched: neon green plates, crumpled feathers stuck in tape, and plastic cups in every shade of turquoise you could imagine. They insisted on setting everything up the night before. Staff warned them it was a tent on the water and would attract dirt, bugs, and spiders overnight. They shrugged it off and cried when they returned to find cobwebs draped across their DIY arrangements. The bride had ordered her dress online months prior and never tried it on again. She had gained a few pounds, and the zipper refused to cooperate. Her solution was to shove a plain white tank top underneath and leave the back completely gaping. No pins, no sewing, just a gap large enough to see the bra straps. After the ceremony, the entire party was heavily intoxicated. The mother of the bride grabbed a folding chair, planted it smack in the middle of the dance floor, and demanded the groom sit. What happened next was surreal. The bride proceeded to give him a lap dance so vigorous that guests gasped, laughed nervously, or ducked behind tables. People who were sober or merely uncomfortable tried to avert their eyes, but the mother was cheering like it was the main event of the century. The music kept skipping, drinks spilled everywhere, and someone attempted to take photos of the moment with a phone camera that died mid-shot. It felt more like a chaotic performance art piece than a wedding. By the end of the night, the tent looked like a hurricane had passed through. Feathers strewn everywhere, plastic cups crushed, a sticky floor, and the lingering smell of alcohol and overcooked food. Story 9. I went to a wedding where kids were trapped in a roach-infested motel. A Cadillac limo caught fire, a dog got attacked by a snake, and the groom ended up arrested, and somehow they still went through with the ceremony. This was a distant cousin's wedding. They lived in a small southern town, and roughly 30 relatives had traveled hundreds of miles to attend. The bride had 4 kids, each with different fathers, and this man she was marrying was none of them. It was midsummer, sweltering and sticky, and nowhere we went, motel, church, or reception hall, had any air conditioning. Everyone was drenched in sweat before the ceremony even began. At the motel, chaos struck immediately. A couple of the children got locked inside a room because the doorknob had been smashed. The phone line had been ripped out of the wall, so calling for help was impossible. The little ones panicked at the sight of giant cockroaches crawling across the room. Staff ended up smashing the window open to get them out, and no one offered alternative accommodations unless asked. The bride's father never left his recliner at the house. He was engrossed in VHS tapes of 1980s wrestling while surrounded by a teetering pile of empty cheap beer cans. It was surreal, like entering a time capsule of dysfunction. 2 of the groomsmen couldn't attend due to recent arrests related to drugs. One of my older cousins was drafted last minute to wear a rented suit and stand-in. Similarly, 2 bridesmaids couldn't make it because of work. A cousin was pressed into service, wearing the oversized dress draped over her shoulder like a prop. The ceremony itself had its own absurdities. No one had bought a unity candle, so the minister's wife had to rush out to a store to buy a dollar store white candle. The wedding paused awkwardly for 10 minutes while everyone waited. The bride's bouquet was a fake potted sunflower that looked more like a craft project than floral art. At the reception, beverages were scarce. The bride's mother spent rent money for their refrigerator to buy a couple of cases of soda. They handed me a boombox to DJ, using a stack of scratch CDs full of country and rap. Most skipped constantly. I had to rotate between a Leanne Rimes album and a children's movie soundtrack just to keep something playing. A 1970s Cadillac limo arrived, belching smoke. Minutes later, the hood was open and a small fire was crawling underneath it. Dinner arrived late, a single aluminum pan of baked beans and a pan of frozen chicken wings. The groom's family grabbed everything, leaving the out-of-state relatives with nothing. After 3 hours of shaky music, a few relatives tried to play a polka tape they brought, prompting the groom's side to storm out entirely. The remaining family pitched in to clean the hall, while the bride's father sat drinking alone. My dad, frustrated, grabbed him by the back of his jacket like a small dog to make him help sweep. Shockingly, he complied. Later, a family dog escaped and was attacked by a snake in the backyard. One of my relatives called my dad, an experienced hunter, to intervene, but he refused. The next day, during gift opening, nearly every present had the groom's last name misspelled. It turned out the invitations had been printed incorrectly, and everyone copied the error to avoid offending the friend who made them. Ultimately, the groom ended up arrested, tied to the same drug incidents as his former groomsmen. The marriage was annulled, but the bride kept his last name. Story 10. I DJ'd a wedding at a stunning estate until a family feud exploded into flying chairs, broken glass, screaming guests, and cops showing up, all in under 5 minutes. I had been hired to provide music at this sprawling estate in the countryside. Normally, it was pristine, manicured lawns, polished floors, chandeliers glinting. But that night, it turned into absolute chaos. The groom's cousin and the maid of honor had a long-standing feud nobody thought would surface until dinner. Mid-meal, the cousin peeled off his suit jacket and shirt, revealing a stained tank top beneath. The maid of honor marched over, whispered something sharp, and they exchanged heated words. A brief shove sent the cousin stumbling outside to cool off, and for a while, things seemed under control. Minutes later, the cousin returned, still partially undressed, weaving between guests on the dance floor. Drinks were flowing, people were laughing, but the air had a prickling edge. By the end of the night, the cousin started yelling about his missing jacket. He accused the maid of honor, slurring insults and swinging his fists in the air. That was the spark. She turned, swung once, and suddenly the whole room erupted. Guests leapt from tables, drinks flew. Someone grabbed a chair, and within seconds, groomsmen, bridesmaids, and a few bold uncles were in the middle of a full-blown melee. The hall manager dove in to stop it and got clocked accidentally. The bride, trapped in the constricting bodice of her dress, collapsed to the floor, curling into a ball for protection. It was like a storm that started on one side and roared straight toward me. I scrambled to tear down my speakers and cords, stuffing cables into cases as punches and shouts echoed around me. Broken glass skittered across the polished floors. Right as I was loading the last speaker into my van, uniformed officers arrived, lights flashing outside. I didn't stick around after that. Paid in full, thankfully. Story 11. I went to a wedding that wasn't even real. No marriage papers, a terrified groom, a domineering bride, and a reception where everyone pretended it was normal, until the truth blew everyone's minds months later. The wedding was entirely fake, though no one attending had any idea. Everything about it reeked of tension from the start. The groom stood at the altar, pale and trembling, like he might collapse at any second. The bride's gown was a disaster, a massive layered skirt that was far too short and a hoop so wide it tilted awkwardly as she walked. Every step made it wobble and scrape, drawing small gasps from the guests. The ceremony itself was stiff and uneasy. Having recently tied the knot got ourselves, my partner and I noticed immediately that the officiant skipped the legally required wording, and no documents were signed, meaning this was not, in fact, a legitimate marriage. Nobody in the crowd realized this until months later. At the reception, nearly the entire first table, the woman for both families, disappeared minutes after the food arrived. The groom's father, who had promised to cover the bar, vanished before paying. The bride and groom avoided each other for the rest of the night, except during a painfully awkward first dance that had everyone squirming. Weeks later, the couple quietly split. Before I tell you what happens next, don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 12. My brother's mountain wedding went perfectly until a massive black bear crashed the party, destroyed the food, and left the aftermath looking like a trash apocalypse overnight. This was my brother's wedding, held deep in the mountains beside a fast-moving river. Beautiful during the day, trees everywhere, open sky, fire pits, grilled food, music echoing through the valley. By nightfall, though, everyone was hammered. Plates piled high with leftover barbecue got abandoned when the party moved to drinking and dancing. Nobody bothered cleaning anything. The plan was apparently deal with it tomorrow. A bunch of us were staying in cabins on the property. Sometime after midnight, crashing noises started. Metal banging, wood creaking, something heavy slamming into things over and over. My brother and I stumbled out of bed half drunk, adrenaline cutting through the hangover before it even started. We grabbed what we could to defend ourselves and looked outside. There was a massive black bear in the parking area. Not wandering, destroying. It had climbed into the back of his truck where trash bags full of food had been tossed, ripping them open and throwing garbage everywhere. Containers, bones, paper plates, sauce-covered foil. Everything flying through the air while it dug for scraps. We couldn't do anything except watch and hope nobody had passed out outside after drinking. The animal kept going, knocking things over, dragging bags across the ground. At one point, it tipped over a large dumpster like it weighed nothing. Eventually, it lost interest and disappeared back toward the trees, leaving the place looking like a disaster zone. We went back to sleep because there wasn't anything else to do. Story 13. This Tennessee wedding was a total dumpster fire from start to finish. Cheating, blackout grooms, runaway toddlers, barnyard chickens, and the bride literally staging a stunt to humiliate her ex. You won't believe what happened. This happened in rural Tennessee. The groom, Jake, had been dating a woman named Lila for years, on again, off again, and constantly cheating on him with anyone who paid attention. One of her side flings was a guy named Darren. Another, less serious, was a kid named Tommy. My cousin had been trying to warn Jake for months, but he never wanted to believe it. Fast forward, Lila and Darren decide to tie the knot. Jake obviously isn't invited, but a bunch of us go to witness the chaos. The venue was a rickety barn by a pond, with string lights barely hanging and hay bales for seating. Right as the ceremony started, Lila breezes past our table, teetering in heels that didn't fit and wearing a dress clearly 3 sizes too small. She smirks at us, muttering that she always imagined Jake would object. The officiant asks if anyone has cause to stop the marriage, and of course no one says a word. Lila had planned this entire wedding as a stunt to get under Jake's skin. During the reception, a drunk Tommy bumps into a toddler playing near the hay bales. The kid's uncle swings and clocks him in the jaw. Tommy staggers off to his truck, revving the engine as he drives away, leaving the kids screaming and Lila shrieking. Meanwhile, Darren has gone full blackout mode. He's vomiting behind a shed while his mother yells at Lila to handle your husband now. She's hysterical, running in circles trying to grab napkins and water bottles while her cheap plastic tiara tilts crookedly on her head. Story 14. This wedding in Nevada wasn't just wild, it was bananas. Literally. Kids in giant banana suits, a groom dressed as a lookador pirate, a gothic bride, sumo wrestlers, and a drunk Elvis DJ. By the end, we were partying through the strip like total chaos incarnate. This was years ago, in Nevada. My friends decided on a mini chaos wedding before the formal one a year later, mostly because the groom needed a US work visa sorted and they figured, why not make it outrageous? Only close friends were invited, aside from one of the bride's kids. The theme? Total ridiculous costume madness. I went as a sparkly circus ringmaster, my boyfriend dressed as a robotic knight. Guests ranged from foam samurai warriors to inflatable sumo wrestlers. The bride went full gothic queen with a custom black velvet gown and skull crown, and the groom was some weird lookador pirate hybrid outfit he'd sewn himself. Their creativity was insane. The kicker, the bride's teen son brought his friend, and both of them were wearing giant banana suits, rigid, bright yellow, wobbling with every step. Somehow, the two of them were chosen to escort the bride down the tiny chapel aisle while the ceremony DJ, who looked suspiciously like a drunk Elvis impersonator, belted out cheesy love songs. The kids flailed around, swaying like they were in some avant-garde interpretive dance, while the bride pretended to glare at them and and the groom awkwardly balanced on his platform boots. Most of us had eaten special brownies earlier, so our tipsy state made it feel like the world was unraveling in slow motion. A few guests live streamed the ceremony for family back home who had no clue about the theme or the bananas. Afterward, we piled into a stretch Hummer limo with confetti still stuck to our hair and drove straight to a tiki bar off the strip. Everyone kept stopping us to take photos, pointing, laughing, and sometimes throwing dollar bills at us. We eventually staggered to a casino steakhouse, where the staff barely blinked at the sumo, skeletons, and sparkling ringmasters wandering in. Plates of overcooked steaks vanished in minutes as cocktails flowed endlessly. Story 15, we got married, stoned out of our minds, ruined every nice wedding photo, screamed at McDonald's at 2 a.m. in my wedding dress, got kicked out cops adjacent, and my husband passed out before we even consummated the marriage. And somehow, it still didn't last 6 months. This happened in late summer, Tennessee. I had just gotten engaged to a guy I barely knew, and we decided to have a tiny, do-it-yourself wedding with our 2 kids as the main party. Rings, dollar store, attire for the kids, hand-me-downs wrapped with masking tape, marriage license. Yup, grabbed it from the county office an hour before the ceremony. Our first choice for the wedding was the apartment courtyard, but a freak thunderstorm rolled in. So we called a small campground a couple miles away and begged them to let us use the covered pavilion. They said yes, but only if we didn't leave it looking like a tornado had hit. We had maybe 10 people show up, immediate family, our weed dealer, and his girlfriend. Everyone got blitzed before the ceremony even started. The officiant was my friend's cousin, who had no idea how to pronounce our names and kept saying, "May these 2 souls, marry forever," or whatever. I don't remember most of the words. I was too high, and my soon-to-be husband was staring at his shoes the entire time. The campground wanted photos for their website, so we tried posing, but our stoned antics turned every shot into a nightmare of dumb faces and half-naked kids running around. After the ceremony, we headed to the only restaurant open at 10 p.m., a fast food chain where I may or may not have screamed at the drive-thru attendant for asking me to leave my wedding dress outside the car. The honeymoon that night was a disaster. We got trashed at a hotel, wandered the streets with bottles in hand, and almost got arrested when a cop passed by, and we screamed something about burning the world down. But my husband passed out before anything happened. We didn't even make it 6 months. Some things just can't be salvaged when you start with a cocktail of poor decisions, drugs, and rage. But man, that night burned itself into memory. Story 16. Imagine a garage wedding with a drunken officiant hiccuping through vows, a 1980s camcorder filming nothing but chins and top-of-the-head shots, and the bride stealing every last dollar 2 months later. This nightmare of a wedding actually happened, and I was there. Years ago, I found myself at a wedding that could only be described as catastrophic from start to finish. My buddy, a low-ranking army private, had met a woman working at a downtown bar. She was infamous in our circle for leaving 2 previous fiancés in financial ruin and emotional wreckage. Somehow he thought she was the one. The wedding was scheduled just weeks before our deployment, so it was rushed, last minute, and completely improvised. No family would be able to attend. None. Only a handful of friends. All of us basically coerced into officiating, standing in, and pretending we were legitimate witnesses. We followed hastily scribbled directions to a suburban split-level house. The chapel was actually a garage. Tools, paint cans, and a lawnmower were hidden behind threadbare curtains and dollar store silk flowers. The concrete floor was covered with a fraying green carpet stained with oil and what I hoped was just water. The bride showed up in a spaghetti strap dress that left little to the imagination. The groom wore his uniform, wrinkled and patched from borrowing it last minute. The officiant reeked of cheap whiskey and hiccuped through the ceremony, occasionally swaying and forgetting entire sentences. His wife was the designated photographer, wielding a massive shoulder-mounted camcorder from 1980s like she was filming a horror movie. She refused to zoom, so every shot was either an extreme close-up of someone's chin or the top of the bride's head. The father of the groom arrived late, glowering, and sat as far from the chaos as possible. His presence didn't stop the train wreck. The vows were mumbled. The first dance was an awkward shuffle to a cassette-recorded country song, and the officiant kept hiccuping into the microphone like it was part of the ceremony. Afterward, the reception was a buffet at a cheap Italian chain. My friend and I got bored and started decorating the groom's car with white shoe polish. Innocent hearts and bells quickly devolved into crude drawings that were visible for months after repeated washes. Rainwater turned them into abstract art no one could unsee. Fast forward 2 months. The bride vanished with the groom's cash, just as she had with her previous partners. Divorce papers arrived while we were still deployed. The groom's pride, money, and dignity were all gone, leaving only the memory of the shambolic ceremony that none of us could ever forget. TLDR, Army Private Mary's notorious cheater, garage wedding, drunk, slurring officiant, 80s camcorder chaos, cheap buffet, crude car vandalism, bride steals everything, and divorces, all predicted by everyone. Total nightmare. Story 17. I officiated a dirt bike wedding for a throuple in the middle of nowhere. No toilets, horse manure, kids pooping mid-ceremony, marijuana haze, and a pregnancy announcement. This was chaos so insane it makes every normal wedding look like a snooze fest. To begin, I didn't just witness this disaster. I led it. I put that in quotes because no court would recognize it. Legally, completely meaningless. Emotionally, a total free-for-all of redneck insanity, weed fumes, and a three-way marriage. Yup, a throuple. 3 adults, 1 chaotic love story, 0 sanity. It was spectacular. Watching it unfold made my own life choices feel like a sane, orderly sitcom in comparison. I was the 3rd person asked to officiate. The first 2 chickened out a week before. Probably for the best. Wife once spent the week prior on a psychedelic spiritual retreat involving questionable substances and hiking in circles. Husband was in full-on dirt bike mode, half drunk, half stoned, all swagger. Wife 2, a born bridezilla. She treated the entire ordeal like an Olympic sport of dominance and chaos. Ceremony location, middle of a dirt bike trail, an hour and a half from civilization, unmarked and utterly remote. Toilets? None. Toilet paper? Non-existent. Privacy curtains? Just a single tree. Catering. Brace yourself, Papa John's pizza, a questionable chicken salad hot dish from Wife 2's sister, and a boxed cake from Wife 1's mom. The decorations were a dirty kid's dirt bike helmet and grimy toys glued on the cake. Drinks were Mountain Dew or beer. Water for their own children? Non-existent. I had to supply it from my own stash meant for another event. Husband roared in on his dirt bike. Wife 1 sauntered in an hour late. Wife 2 followed 90 minutes behind schedule. The aisle was a 5-minute stumble from the RV where everyone got ready. No photographer, narrowly. I recruited a friend to snap shots on her phone while juggling a newborn and a cigarette. Miraculously, she captured some moments that could pass for actual memories. After waiting an hour and a half to start, I kicked off the ceremony by reading a poem to the Three's Company theme song. Only 3 guests got it. The mothers cried, thinking I'd orchestrated a heartwarming tribute. I didn't correct them. Let them have their moment. Post-ceremony, the chaos escalated. The entire party took off on dirt bikes. Wife 2 attempted a dramatic jump off her bike and landed squarely in horse manure. The kids laughed. She went full meltdown mode, shrieking about their rudeness. Wife 1 zoomed over to defend her kids, yelling at Wife 2 to stop humiliating them. Dirt bike helmets collided with screaming voices in a perfect symphony of madness. Reception? A haze of smoke and giggles. Husband passed joints to everyone with the zeal of a carnival vendor. Amid the haze, Wife 2 announced she was pregnant. I glanced at Wife 1 and husband cheering her on, and simultaneously noticed a 7-year-old squatting against a tree, yelling for toilet paper mid-poop. That was my cue to escape before authorities intervened. Or worse, I got roped into mediating the fecal disaster. I told you, glorious, unhinged, apocalyptic, the 3-way dirt bike wedding that defies logic, reason, and basic hygiene. Story 18. I officiated a wedding in a condemned, rat-infested middle school while an AA meeting ran next door. Groomsmen fled mid-ceremony. Horror masks and cardboard crowns were everywhere, and the catered reception was ham sandwiches from a gas station. Absolutely insane. Before I tell you what happens next, don't forget to like and subscribe. I was an internet-ordained officiant, drafted at the last minute to preside over my childhood friend's wedding. This role sometimes grants me VIP perks, but on this occasion, those perks felt meaningless. Lunch was provided, allegedly catered, but the spread consisted entirely of individually wrapped ham sandwiches from a convenience store chain. I politely refused. Hours later, I learned the reception meal was the exact same thing. Theme? Zombie superheroes. Women wore tiny cardboard crowns. Men wore horror movie masks. One groomsman looked like he had escaped from a haunted funhouse. Preparation chaos. The groomsmen were crammed into the old woodshop, a room still smelling of sawdust, paint thinner, and mold. The ceiling had a gaping hole, exposing what could only be 1960s era insulation raining down in fibrous clumps. Rat droppings littered the floor. The groom's teenage cousin roamed the room, critiquing underwear choices and generally providing unsolicited commentary while we got dressed. All of this was happening mere feet from an active AA meeting. No one batted an eye. 10 minutes before the ceremony, the groom's brother, also a groomsman, lost his mind when his ex showed up with some new boyfriend. He ripped off his rented tux in a panic, shouting, "I can't stay here. I'm going to ruin everything," before leaping into his truck and speeding off down the country road. No negotiation worked. He was gone. We scrambled to find a replacement and proceeded with the shortened ceremony. Afterward, I herded the wedding party outside for photos, expecting the guests to follow for the reception. 20 minutes later, everyone was still seated like statues. I wandered back into the cafeteria to announce, very sheepishly, that lunch was ready. Ham sandwiches, chips, and soda. The family and friends looked both angry and bewildered, but eventually shuffled forward. Even with all the absurdity, the day was somehow joyful for the newlyweds. And while I've officiated backyard weddings and courthouses ceremonies myself, this one remains unforgettable. Broken ceilings, rat droppings, ex-boyfriends fleeing mid-outfit, and convenience store catering, truly a testament to chaos theory in action. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Got a story to share? Drop it in the comments and let us know which one was your favorite.